Somewhere along the line, too many people got the message that marriage is supposed to be some sort of endurance sport and that there's some kind of medal for those who make it last, no matter how horrific it is. These kinds of societal judgments foster shame. And honestly, you need to be some kind of Jedi to be immune to these societal judgments. These kinds of judgments hurt. Today what we're going to talk about is sort of this sense of fatigue and brain fog that people who are experiencing narcissistic abuse go through. So let's just start with that sense. You're going through narcissistic abuse. You are always tired. Always. It actually kind of sucks to say to everyone, I'm tired, I'm tired. You're tired even when you are getting enough sleep. Fatigue and brain fog, they suck. It leaves us feeling all the time like we're on our B game, even when we're doing the work. We aren't as mentally acute. We aren't as physically on point. We're not as present in our lives as we want. So many people experiencing narcissistic abuse report having, again, this kind of brain fog, not thinking clearly or sharply, or even that their memory isn't working as well, which makes sense. They're under so much stress and in some cases trauma, and all of that is a part of what we'd expect in narcissistic abuse. Narcissistic abuse contributes to fatigue in multiple ways, and fatigue is a common issue in people who are in narcissistic relationships. First of all, rumination, as has already been discussed in this series, rumination is a big player in fatigue. When you are ruminating, it's a bit like when your computer is running multiple programs, or you have too many windows open at the same time, or your phone is running too many apps, or you have too many of your little windows open at the same time. The device moves more slowly. Ruminating is like having a bunch of programs constantly running in the background of your brain. You're in your head. You're constantly trying to mentally fix things, which in the case of narcissistic relationships cannot be fixed. You're in your head. You're regretting things that you said. You're wishing things were different. Rumination pulls you out of your life. And thinking while you're ruminating, and because of the ruminating, actually requires energy. So when you're thinking all the time, you become fatigued. And then add to that confusion and other patterns of narcissistic abuse, and you're even more exhausted. Second, in a narcissistic relationship, you are always hustling to be more than enough. There's a sort of a perfectionistic pull to get it right, because if you get it right, then you'll be able to appease or even win over that difficult person or people in your life. And it's exhausting because it can't be done. You're never going to win them over. There's never enough for a narcissist. So in essence, you just keep building up a tower just to have it get knocked down every single day. There's not only a psychological grief that is raised by this process, and grief is an exhausting process. It's also tiring to do all the stuff so you feel like you're enough. It's tiring to keep the house just so, to keep your appearance just so, or your kids just so, or your office organized just so, or the files organized just so, and then do all of that, and it goes unnoticed or criticized. Third, for many people, this has been a lifetime of narcissistic relationships. This started in childhood and then crept into adulthood. There was never a time of just exhaling. It is tiring to spend your entire life in a state of tension and being wound up. And that chronic tension results in fatigue. If you've ever been tense for a while, you know how exhausting that is. Fourth, people in narcissistic relationships do not sleep well. The rumination, above all else, is one of the many things of narcissistic abuse. It interrupts your sleep. You might be able to fall asleep, but if you wake up in the middle of the night, you find that you can't go back to sleep. You ruminate about what happened. Arguments before bedtime make it hard to fall asleep. The confusion can plague you the minute you wake up in the middle of the night and you just can't go back to sleep. And when people don't sleep, they're tired. Fifth, these relationships are narcissistic relationships are chronically disappointing. You keep waiting for it, right? You keep waiting for that day of empathy. You keep waiting for the moment of compassion. You keep waiting for the big hour of insight. You keep waiting for the apology that could make so much of it better. You keep waiting for the moment they'll finally see you, finally get you, and finally get it. And not only is that time probably never going to come, all the other disappointments of the relationship are also mounting up, whether it's lying or betrayal or not listening in a way they don't listen, and that results in numerous miscommunications, or they're always late, or they criticize all the little things you do or that matter to you, or their numerous daily invalidations. It is exhausting to live in chronic disappointment. On top of that, it's also exhausting to keep waiting for the day when it's all going to be all right. It's basically like waiting in the rain for a bus that is never going to come. It is fatiguing to keep future faking yourself. The fatigue observed in narcissism is a combination of sort of regular tired, as I call it, the tired you'd get if you stressed or you're tense and lack of sleep. But it's also soul tired. Soul tired is a kind of existential tired, where you ask yourself, is this really as good as it gets? Is this really how difficult human relationships are? Is this what marriage is? Is this what my mother's going to always be like? It's a grief that never fades. This never-ending banging drum of loss, of regret, of life, and of love feeling difficult. Like the grief and the disappointment of having to learn things at 40 that should have probably been easily shown to you when you were 5. This fatigue stinks because it pulls you out of your life in so many other ways. You aren't as present, you aren't as mindful, you aren't as efficient, you're very distracted, and you may not have the energy to pursue the goals you want. So not only do you always have this foggy feeling of fatigue, you're actually missing out on your own life. So what are you supposed to do? Number 1, work on something we call sleep hygiene. Or what's sleep hygiene? It's how you do the whole sleep routine. While the rumination is hard to let go of, and we already have a video on rumination in this series, this whole patterns of narcissistic abuse series. So there's some tips on that, on how to push back on the rumination. But just like a little child needs a bedtime routine, adults do as well, especially if they're struggling with sleep. You need to have a consistent bedtime. The usual stuff is staying off screens before bed, trying to manage the light levels and temperature of your room. Not always easy if you have to share your bedroom with a narcissistic partner. I get that. Ideally, especially if this is a workplace narcissist, do not check emails or texts if you can avoid it for 1 hour before bed. And if you are continuing to have difficulty with sleep, it is also important to talk about this with your healthcare provider in case there are other issues contributing to your problems with sleep beyond the rumination and stress. I recognize that sleep interruption, and there's also a video in this narcissistic abuse series on sleep difficulties, so another one you could look at to get some tips, is only a piece of this. But it's a piece to address when it comes to fatigue, is to understand, are you getting enough sleep? Number 2, healing skills and healing practices like radical acceptance and realistic expectations can actually go a long way to helping you with this. Sometimes the disappointment and the "I can't believe that happened again" of your life keeps you awake at night. Doing the work of acceptance, painful as it may be, can also shake out some of those disappointments that do keep you awake at night. Number 3, this is also about grief work, okay? You need to do the grief work of letting go of what you won't get or didn't get or can't get because of the narcissistic relationship or relationships you've experienced. You can't go back when you're an adult and go back and have a healthy childhood. But you can start from this moment forward to taking your own self back and not living in a past that you can't recreate. You can't undo this marriage. You're going to have to see it through. The time was spent in it. We can't get time back, but we can work more meaningfully with the time we have left. Number 4, using mindfulness and meditation to work on staying in the moment. Again, narcissistic relationships and survivors of narcissistic abuse often struggle with regret and worrying about their past and their future. Mindfulness can help address some of that mental drain, fatigue, brain fog, by keeping you, at least for a part of each day, in the present moment, which is its own form of clearing out. It can reorient you, clear your mind, and be a little bit of a hedge against the fatigue. But if you are having fatigue at a level that seems surprising, it's new, it represents a significant shift, it's very important too that you do see your healthcare provider. Fatigue coming into your life at a level that you really are having trouble managing it, you need to make sure you rule out any other medical causes that could be happening. It may very well be the narcissistic issues, but it's always important when you're having this level of chronic fatigue that you do see a healthcare provider to rule out any other concerns that may need to be worked up using laboratory or other kinds of data. So let's talk about this issue of second guessing and indecision and self-doubt that is such a classical part of narcissistic abuse. To me, this is the signature pattern of narcissistic abuse. The no longer being able to trust your own decisions, your own opinions, your own thoughts. As time goes on, it gets so extreme, you stop trusting your own instincts about everything, even if you are hungry or tired. You get so used to the narcissist telling you that you're hungry or telling you whatever you are, that it's as though you have been hijacked in every possible way. A primary reason of this pattern, for this pattern of second guessing and self-doubt, and that it is so central in narcissistic abuse, is really because of the gaslighting. Really think about it. Gaslighting, which is the deliberate denial of your reality, is designed to foster self-doubt. If you are told you are too sensitive, you start doubting your level of emotionality. If you are told something didn't happen, you doubt your memory. If you are told you have no right to feel that way, you doubt your right to feel. Your doubts and second guessing may look lots of different ways. You might think, maybe I am making too big a deal out of her text to that guy she works with. Maybe I am being too selfish by trying to go back to school and get that degree. Maybe he did tell me that he was going to be working late. I don't remember. Maybe I am being too hard on my mother. She did make sure we had dinner most nights. Maybe I shouldn't expect so much. This pattern of second guessing starts down a spiral toward making you indecisive in all realms of your life. It makes sense. A key part of narcissistic abuse is constantly you trying to do the impossible, which is to please the unpleasable narcissist. So you do everything you can do to win them over. In essence, you give up on yourself to please them. You take on their interests, go to places that they want, eat the foods they want at the times they want, have conversations about things they want, mostly conversations about them and what they're interested in. You learn to not ask for anything you need or want or ever voice a preference. So over time, yeah, you actually do start to lose touch with what does matter to you, which may even be about survival. It's painful to think about the things that matter to you, since you can only do them on the times that you are away from the narcissist. I remember one couple in particular. The husband was a controlling, neglectful, egocentric, he was just a simply dreadful person. The woman was actually quite kind and empathic and asked for very little from life and, from the world. They lived in a relatively large home, and she loved purchasing these little knickknacks and, little pictures and things like that on her little trips or in local shops. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. He refused to let her put the art that she enjoyed on the walls or on the shelves, and the few times she would actually do it, he would criticize her so mercilessly that she decided it wasn't worth it, and over time, she packed up her little treasures and put them away. But sadly, over time, and in parallel to this woman also stopped being able to ask for anything she wanted, even with other people outside of the narcissistic relationship. He just sort of bullied and took over everything in her life. They ate when he wanted, and they ate what he wanted. They went on vacation only when he wanted, to where he wanted. They watched the TV programs he wanted. She was just sort of a sad additional occupant of her own home. Why and what could she have done? Possibly. How could she have possibly learned to voice her preferences? So what this means is that in some ways you lose practice in making a decision or being confident in your choices. On top of that, if you do weigh in on a decision with a narcissist, they will either reject it and berate it, or if they do accept it, blame you for years if it did not go the way that they had wanted. So after a while, you just stop trying and definitely stop trusting your own judgment. This can really hamstring people in a profound way. People may find that even when they are not with a narcissist, they are unable to weigh in on a decision. They'll say things like, "Oh no, we can go anywhere you want for dinner. I'm good. I don't care what movie we watch. We can go to any movie. We can do whatever you want tonight. We can get together whatever time you want." Because you're so used to capitulating, and you're so unused to making decisions and having your decisions respected, or living in fear of making the wrong choice. In addition, it can also hurt you in your professional spaces, not just in where should we go to dinner, but it can hurt you in the professional spaces like your career or in making professional choices. You may not weigh in on important decisions in the workplace, or you may hesitate so much that you don't get advanced in a job because you're considered to be too tentative. You may waffle between two choices for too long and miss a deadline. You may not know what classes to take, and then don't put your form in early enough, so you end up getting none of your classes. Your inability to make choices can really be a major weight that holds you back in all kinds of professional endeavors, and frankly, in all kinds of relationships. As I noted above, or during this video, it's not just the challenges in making decisions and second-guessing yourself. It's also the giving in. It's also what I'm calling the capitulation. You may give in on everything, even things that matter to you, because the mantra of the narcissistic relationship is that you go along to get along. And because so many people who come from narcissistic families or who have stayed in narcissistic relationships are people pleasers, The giving in and just not making your needs known so you can please the narcissist becomes dangerous second nature for you. The second guessing that is such a classical part of narcissistic abuse starts in an obvious place, and it is a little different than the decision-making challenges. It's the doubts that plague you after you make the decision. It almost takes the joy out of life. You then sit down and say, I'm worried I ordered the wrong thing at the restaurant. I must have chosen the wrong restaurant. I should have bought the other dress. I never should have gone to that event. I should have stayed home instead. We should have never bought that car. We should have bought that house instead. A big part of the ruminative pattern can be the second guessing to the point where you literally get paralyzed, distressed, or really, really upset. Now, obviously, all of this kind of exists under the banner of self-doubt. Being in a narcissistic relationship, coming from a narcissistic family, working in a narcissistic and toxic workplace, because you're being so regularly gaslighted, manipulated, invalidated, and belittled, you are constantly plagued by self-doubt. The most central self-doubt emanates from the other mantra of all narcissistic relationships. I am not good enough. If that is your starting off place, you can see how doubting yourself at every turn in the road is going to do you in. You talk yourself out of everything. I don't have what it takes to finish my master's degree. I'm never going to make the soccer team. I don't have a chance of getting that promotion. I could never write a book. I'm not going to get hired for that job. You know the drill. You talk yourself out of it before you even get to the starting gate. Ironically, I know I talked about sleep problems in this series. Self-doubt and second guessing are the things that keep you up at night. Boom, wake up at 2 in the morning, you're full of self-doubt. Just like rumination, it's what keeps you up. Personally, as a survivor of more than a few narcissistic relationships, this particular symptom feels personal to me. I own it because it's the one that has done the most damage in my life. I have screwed up major life decisions because of my struggles with self-doubt and indecision. I still doubt myself in many areas, and yeah, even after I research and I develop and I shoot a video, I will doubt that it made its point. I'll doubt that it makes sense. I'll doubt that it's clear. And I'm mercifully, I have an extraordinary team that works with me to reassure me. But years I've been working through this, and I've been trying to push through. But damn, 54 years old, I'm still not past this one. The things the narcissist does are a setup for self-doubt, second guessing, and indecision. I hope there are some of you watching this who maybe don't have a narcissist in your life, but are watching this as a supporter of someone who has endured or is enduring narcissistic abuse. Please understand that they're not being indecisive because they're slow-witted or ridiculous. This is actually really hard for them. So, what do we do? And let's see if I could take my own advice, since this is my issue too. First of all, make some decisions. Start with some low-stakes ones. Chocolate or vanilla, paper or plastic, fries or onion rings. Just make a choice. Make it from the gut and stick with it. Then you can advance to bigger ones. In the worst case, you should have gotten the chocolate. Number 2, make some non-observed decisions. For many people going through narcissistic abuse, it can be even more difficult if they feel their choice is being scrutinized. Make some choices without an audience. It may feel like lower stakes, and it may build up your confidence in making choices. Number 3, and this is a common one, make a pro and con list, but I want you to make a pro and con list with a twist. for a bigger decision, for example, like which apartment to rent, which car to purchase, which job to take, make a pro and a con list because it's a good thing to do. But then I want you to make a third column on your pro and con list. And I want that to be called, what am I worried about and whose voice am I hearing? Many times you want, for example, the apartment you want. You're like, bang, that's the one. But you hear the voice of the narcissist saying, ugh, this isn't a very hip neighborhood, or what an ugly building. I wouldn't be caught dead there, but if you love this apartment, well, let's say you're buying a car and you decide you want to get the cheaper car so you can save for school. Again, you got to ask yourself when you're having trouble with this decision, looking at your pro and con list, whose voice is it? Is it the narcissist saying, you're not going to have any game if you're driving that old car? That third column in your pro and con list is really important because once you can see how much their BS is impeding your decision-making process, you may be more willing to make a choice that works for you and understand how their voice is what's messing up the works. And you know what's next. You can tell me what tip 4 is going to be. Therapy. Play out your choices with your therapist. We're neutral parties, and we might be able to help you break some of this choice down. Remember, we don't have skin in the game. We don't care what car you buy. Number 5, do some mental exercises. Mentally play out the decisions in your mind. Close your eyes and really play them out. And pay attention to how you feel. Connecting your feelings and your choice can also help you climb this indecisive mountain. This is one of those patterns that can be really quite tough to break. Think of the bright side. You did choose to watch this video. Now, go make a choice to do something, anything that's good for you. Each choice is a fresh start. Making decisions begets making more decisions. And if you always pay attention to, it's that narcissistic voice, that naysaying voice that pushes the second guessing, the indecision, the self-doubt, that you can start dismantling this piece by piece and slowly start trusting your judgment. And sometimes you might just decide to get the chocolate and the vanilla. Let's just see it that way. Let's start talking about shame as an element of narcissistic abuse. Now, in this episode, we are not going to be talking about the shame of the narcissist, something we've already talked about. We are actually going to be talking about the shame that is a part of the experience of narcissistic abuse. I have already talked at length about shame and narcissism. Remember, we talked about the shame rage spiral, and if you don't remember, that's a video, it's a part of a different video, different series, but the fact that narcissists are in the shame rage spiral, they're driven by shame, and they fear that their deficits will be found out. Shame is very much a core issue in narcissism. However, when it comes to survivors of narcissistic abuse, shame is also a very big issue that we observe in people who've experienced the fallout of a narcissistic relationship. So let's go back to the basics on shame. I have read in a few sources that shame is considered a public emotion, meaning that it is a negative emotion that gets activated when a person's flaws or deficits are publicly noted. Shame is a very human experience, and often I actually think it's not a healthy one because shame pushes us into the shadows. We, all of us, are in fact, we're human and none of us are perfect, and shame is the rest of the world seeing our flaws, our normalness, which may trigger ancient wounds that we have over not being good enough. Fears that we may have, that we might be rejected because we aren't perfect or because we're flawed. A cynic might even argue that our entire economy is based on shame. In essence, we sort of buy things to fix our deficits so we don't feel as ashamed. Now, when it comes to narcissistic abuse, shame gets triggered in so many ways, and a lot of this has to do with the nature of the narcissistic relationship. So if you have more than one narcissistic relationship in your life, you will feel more than one kind of shame. It's as though the kind of shame you have might be different based on the person, who they are in your life. Now, if your narcissistic abuse happened in your family of origin, the shame may emanate from this sense of being from a dysfunctional family. A child obviously may not be able to label their family as narcissistic, but a child definitely knows something isn't quite right. Children from narcissistic family systems will often exhaust themselves in trying to portray their family as normal to the rest of the world because the alternative is really stressful for them. As a child spends time with other children, for example, and perhaps sees how other healthier family systems operate, there can be tremendous shame when they think about the patterns they're experiencing in their own narcissistic families. Now, interestingly, this shame pattern for children from narcissistic families, you'll often see in these children, they'll often have a very rich fantasy world. Their fantasies might be things like, maybe my parents are going to get a divorce, that might actually be kind of a relief, or that their parents might finally change and stop invalidating them, or perhaps in a bigger fantasy, new parents will sweep in and replace their narcissistic parents, or new siblings, or anything, all kinds of fantasies about escaping the family. You can also see the grandiose fantasies in kids who come from narcissistic families. In these grandiose fantasies, the child might have fantasies over becoming tremendously successful, that they win every sports competition or school competition, or that someday they become famous and make a lot of money, and then maybe their family will finally notice them and praise them. But throughout all of this, the core emotion being activated is shame, a sense of shame over a family that isn't good enough. That reminds the child that they aren't good enough. Now, if this is your intimate relationship, shame also consistently surfaces as a part of narcissistic abuse. Many times, it's shame about feeling that you made a bad choice and that you can't escape it. Sometimes, it's the shame over how problematic and dysfunctional your relationship is, but you have concerns about outing your relationship and outing your partner and how difficult they are, and that might reflect, for example, poorly on your children or on you. In many cases, you may not be ready to leave your narcissistic relationship, and shame can end up leaving you very isolated because you may not want to talk to other people about how bad your relationship has gotten. Because if you do not leave the relationship, then there's not only this concern about how negatively people will view your partner and your relationship, but also that you may feel shame over choosing to stay in something that's so broken, which now people know because you told them. So instead of that, you may just sit alone with it as you figure out sort of your next move, which now you're doing in a vacuum because you're not getting feedback from anyone. This sense of shame, when it is your close relationship, can get magnified in so many places. For example, when the world gaslights you and tells you that, oh, come on, I'm sure your marriage isn't that bad, or you're making too big a deal out of what your wife is doing, or gosh, come on now, these things happen, maybe you're just being too sensitive. When other people say those kinds of things to you, and you put that on top of the gaslighting you're experiencing in your relationship, these words ring so loud in your ears, and you feel ashamed at failing at a relationship, and then blaming yourself, and again, isolating yourself. There is also the shame so many people have that you're the one who made this mess by choosing this person. If you had a choice, obviously, in choosing this person, obviously I know that there are people out there who had less of a say in who they ended up marrying. For example, if you had sort of a required relationship or a heavily arranged marriage. I'm not talking about that. But you may feel ashamed you made a bad choice, that you didn't see the red flags, or that you did see the red flags and you ignored them. In fact, more than a few times, I have observed people going through rather contentious divorces and being told that, well, the court isn't here to fix your bad choices. So it ends up becoming a shameful mistake you end up paying for a lifetime through problematic custody for your kids or financial ruin. Because shame is a public emotion, society plays a big part in it. We live in a culture of relationship grandiosity. If your relationship isn't insta-perfect, or if you end your relationship or get a divorce, there is so much judgment out there about it, and this sense of failure people walk around with. And since most of the world does not understand narcissistic abuse, when you try to explain it, should you try to explain, for example, what has gone wrong in your relationship to other people, you may get blank stares or judgmental people telling you, well, you shouldn't diagnose your partner and call them narcissistic, and that you're being too harsh or you're being an armchair psychologist. Somewhere along the line, too many people got the message that marriage is supposed to be some sort of endurance sport and that there's some kind of medal for those who make it last, no matter how horrific it is. These kinds of societal judgments foster shame. And honestly, you need to be some kind of Jedi to be immune to these societal judgments. These kinds of judgments hurt. And cultural issues don't help. In so many cultures, not being married is considered shameful. Shameful for the person, shameful for their family. Marrying the wrong person is shameful. Getting divorced is shameful. Shame then becomes a tool of societal control to snap everyone into obedience and adherence to authoritarian rules that oversee relationships. In these cultural structures, there is often little recourse for those in narcissistically abusive relationships. People in these relationships may feel as though they need to put up and shut up to avoid the shame induction by their family, their community, and the culture at large. For all of these reasons, your own individual experience, the reactions of your family, community, and culture, and our own obsessions with the mythical idea of putting our false face to the world that everything's perfect, that's a setup for shame. And people in narcissistic relationships of any kind, family relationships and partner relationships in particular, know that these feelings of shame persist for a very, very long time, sometimes a lifetime. Shame is dangerous because it isolates you. It invokes more negative emotions and can keep you stuck in these narcissistic relationships. You end up just channeling an inauthentic version of yourself to fake it and avoid the shame. But then you lose yourself and give up your authentic self to make it last. So what do you do? What do you do about this issue of shame? This isn't easy. First, and more than anything, start learning to speak your truth. We're living in very interesting times where society and the people in it are becoming more and more maddening. And just again, it could be this moment in history. It could be some sort of strange shift in the world at large. But stop getting so much of your sense of self from society. Figure out who your healthy people are and stick to that safe place. We all have to go out into the real world, but we don't need to get our self-worth from it. Remember that. By remembering that societal judgment can be a little less powerful. Number 2, therapy becomes a very important space to air some of what feels like this forbidden stuff out to a neutral observer, and I hope a very empathic observer, who can hear this and help you understand these core issues of shame and how they may have, for example, led you to get isolated or hold back from talking about things or even keep you stuck in a bad situation. Number 3, I want you to seek out support in the stories of others. In fact, what I'd love to see some of you do in the comment section, if you feel like you can hide your identity if you need to through your username, look at the stories of the people in these comment section, if not this video, another. Knowing that this many people are watching this kind of content, you are not alone in this. And sometimes when you start to realize that, you didn't make some grand mistake. You're just human. Your family is probably about as dysfunctional as everyone else's. It's not a statement on you. By creating community, whether it's dropping something in the comments here and reading them, whether it's joining an online support group, whether it's joining any other kind of support group with other survivors of narcissistic abuse, that can also help push back on those feelings of shame and realize that you are simply human. Shame is a very common part of the narcissistic abuse picture, and I hope that you understand that if you can start to connect back in with your authentic humanity, you're going to realize that that might end up being one of the best antidotes of all and help bring you out of the shadows. Whether or not you leave your narcissistic relationship, if you can lift some of the shame element, it may help you function in a more healthy manner in your life and in your healthy relationships. So let's talk about this idea of the sense of depression or depressed mood we see in people who are experiencing narcissistic abuse. So I'm going to start this particular video with a disclaimer. As I describe the symptoms of depression, if they fit, it is absolutely essential that you speak to a healthcare provider ASAP. And this can be a primary healthcare provider, this could be you seeking out a therapist. Major depressive disorder and other related mood disorders are no joke. They are serious illnesses and absolutely should not go untreated. We will include resources at the end of this video to get more information about depression. I am briefly going to talk about what depression is, and then we'll talk about it within the context of narcissistic abuse. Depression in its many forms is what we call a mood disorder, and diagnostically is classified as a person who for 2 weeks or longer, on more days than not, is experiencing sad or irritable mood, or is experiencing a loss of pleasure in activities that have typically given the person pleasure. Then, the symptoms and patterns we see typically include a change in appetite, a change in sleep patterns. For example, you can't fall asleep, can't stay asleep, or can't wake up, or all three, or where you wake up very exhausted, feelings of worthlessness, difficulties with concentration, low energy and fatigue, suicidal thoughts, a sense of helplessness or hopelessness, a sense of apathy or an inability to get anything going or do anything, tearfulness, moving more slowly than usual, and oftentimes social withdrawal. We look to see if these patterns or symptoms are resulting in significant social and occupational impairment, meaning you're having trouble at work or with relationships. And we also want to see if whether you're able to still take care of yourself, take care of other people, and also look at whether or not you're able to, again, engage in work, engage in school. That's depression. A diagnosis, one of the most common mental illnesses in the world, affecting over 250 million people worldwide. Now, not everyone has the full diagnosis of depression. For some people, they may have a sad mood that comes and goes. They may not get as much pleasure out of life as most people in the same way, or they may have selected symptoms that may not last the full 2 weeks. Sad mood and the related symptoms are often a response to stress. In fact, stress and depression are well known to be closely related. Stress is not only associated with depressive symptoms, but also with full-blown major depression. And narcissistic abuse is clearly a stressor. So let's talk about patterns of depression as a part of narcissistic abuse. Nearly everyone who experiences narcissistic abuse shows some symptoms of depression. It may be sadness, or irritability, or sleep problems, or concentration problems. The real challenge arises because a person may develop depression while they are in their narcissistic relationship, or they may have had a history of depression they brought into the narcissistic relationship, and the stress of the narcissistic abuse is exacerbating the depressive symptomatology. In addition, the stress of originating from a narcissistically abusive family will also heighten the risk of depression and depressive symptoms. Again, the challenge is this. Bottom line, if you are depressed, that's got to be treated, whether or not you're experiencing narcissistic abuse or not. However, there is the elephant in the room. If you weren't in this narcissistic relationship, would some of these symptoms subside? As a mental health practitioner, neither myself or anyone else can magically wave a wand and remove your stressors or the people in your life. We have to work with the issues in front of us. In that way, getting your depression or depressive mood symptoms treated becomes an essential first step. At a minimum, that needs to happen so you have the energy and the focus to start dealing with healing from narcissistic abuse. A major challenge is that if you present to therapy as moderately or mildly depressed, even severely depressed, or just depressed, that will become the focus of the therapy, which can then leave the conversation about narcissistic abuse by the wayside. To me, the gold standard is that we manage the depressive and other psychiatric symptoms early, and then get to the work of narcissistic abuse. Unfortunately, the way insurance works and the lack of information about narcissistic abuse out there means that when the depression starts to resolve, and especially if you're getting therapy with meds, you're going to resolve, you may be considered done. It makes sense that depression and narcissistic abuse would co-occur, and that depressive symptoms would be part and parcel of narcissistic abuse survivorship. The powerlessness and self-devaluation that are built into narcissistic relationships are a catalyst, and they're also a part of narcissistic abuse. But the challenge becomes how much depression and narcissistic abuse actually have in common. In this series, you will see me take on patterns that are part of both depression and narcissistic abuse. People living with depression often experience helplessness, hopelessness, powerlessness, indecisiveness, loneliness and isolation, worthlessness, shame, irritability, and suicidal thoughts. So do people with narcissistic abuse. In fact, a fair question would be, if they have so much in common, maybe narcissistic abuse patterns are just depression. There, I would argue differently. First of all, many people with depression aren't going through narcissistic abuse. But let's look at it this way. You go to therapy to get help, and you look really depressed. You are really depressed. And again, if you're experiencing the patterns of narcissistic abuse, many, if not most clinicians, are also going to think you're depressed. Narcissistic abuse, depression, they're just going to think you're depressed. So they treat it in good faith as depression. And then you start doing a little bit better, but you're still in your narcissistic relationship or relationships. Or if it's a lot more narcissistic abuse, you may not start getting that much better at all. I remember years ago attending a lecture in South Africa from a person or with a person who was working with trauma survivors in South Africa. And she said, sometimes we need to scratch our heads and ask ourselves exactly what we are doing, putting people back together again, having them do the hard work of therapy just to send them back into abusive and traumatic situations. I remember listening to her, and I felt this combination of sadness and anger and frustration, because she was absolutely right. What are we doing? So perhaps you go to therapy. Maybe you even are referred to a psychiatrist or your physician, you get some medication. And while you may feel a bit more energized, maybe even a little bit less depressed, you are still dealing with the day-to-day invalidation, minimization, dismissiveness, gaslighting, manipulation, and rage. You know the drill. It's normal to feel depressed if you are in an emotionally abusive relationship and a world of people telling you to cheer up and count your blessings is just a cruel, gaslighty antagonism. So if you are in a narcissistically abusive relationship of any kind and are experiencing depressive symptoms, the optimal setup is to work with a therapist who understands narcissistic abuse. Those of us who do this work on narcissistic abuse will address the depression, but simultaneously will also address the narcissistic abuse. And just when your mood may be resolving is when the work on the narcissistic abuse needs to ramp up. Interestingly, if the narcissistic abuse occurred in your family of origin, or occurs in your family of origin, you may not experience these sort of depressive symptoms every day. You may actually kind of be living your life and then get propelled back into your family of origin for some reason, holidays, family illness, some other family event, and have to deal with it, all of it again. And then the sadness and other sort of depression adjacent symptoms will emerge again. That tells you something right there. You were living your life, get close to the family again, and then you start feeling sad. Narcissistic relationships are something we can sort of term dose-response relationships. The more of the dose you get, the stronger the response, like certain medications. The more you take, the stronger the effect. These relationships get more toxic the more of the narcissist you have to experience. Pay attention to your patterns. If your narcissist or narcissists are not a daily feature, you may find that your depressive symptoms ramp up only when you are in their presence, but otherwise, you are doing fine. Logic would dictate that you remove the stimulus that is associated with the negative response, in this case, the depressive mood. The stimulus would be the toxic person. But I know that's not always possible. Being from a narcissistic family of origin can actually leave you with a sort of a heavy sense that kind of bothers you for a lifetime. The more you can recognize that you are not responsible for them, the better it is for you. But that's a process. So what do? First of all, regardless of the stimulus or the trigger or the reasons, if you are experiencing depressive symptoms, you must get intervention. Untreated depression is very bad for your health, so treatment is essential. In an ideal universe, you would work with someone clinically who is well versed in both narcissistic abuse and general mental health. There's just not a lot of people who do it. Number 2, if you are feeling suicidal, you must seek out help immediately. Whether that's calling emergency services or the suicide hotline, and we are going to have those resources in the notes for this video, you must call immediately. Number 3, I want you to pay attention to patterns. Do you find that your depressive symptoms get significantly exacerbated when you spend more time with the narcissist in your life? And that these symptoms may actually abate or fade away when you're not with the narcissist? That's not how classical clinical depression typically works. Traditionally, in most cases of depression, the symptoms are present across situations and are pervasive and relatively continuous. If there is that stop-start, pay attention to that, because in that case, this really may be about getting education and support for your narcissistic abuse with as much rigor as you're dealing with your depressive symptoms. Fourth, treatment is absolutely essential for depression, but so too are what we call adjunct treatments, such as exercise, better sleep, mindfulness, and other daily practices such as meditation can all be essential. In addition, this isn't just about addressing your negative thoughts about yourself, but also about maintaining realistic thoughts about your narcissistic relationship. Sometimes, as hard as those thoughts are, thoughts like this isn't going to change, this person really does not care about me or anyone else, it's still a lot better for you and easier than blaming yourself. Thank you so much for listening to this content about depression. It's very, very easy to write it off as depression, and for many clinicians say, we've treated the depression, and then you go back into your narcissistic relationship and it feel like a resolving door. It could feel, it's funny I said resolving door. I meant revolving door. It could feel like a revolving door going around and around and around with nothing ever getting better. Please do refer to the notes for this video. We will be putting some fact sheets and other information about the suicide hotline, so you have that information if you do want more information about depression and treatment. Again, depressive symptoms are a very, very common part of the picture of narcissistic abuse, and kind of separating out what part is narcissistic abuse and what part is classical depression can actually be a bit of a tricky and surgical diagnostic procedure. Thanks again.